When I first encountered the whole free will debate as a sophomore in college, it caused me quite a bit of distress. There were sleepless nights. I was bothered by the fact that the course of my life was actually carved in some determinist stone. How successful or how unsuccessful I would turn out to be was fixed, and I had no ability to change that future. But I was taking a philosophy class, and that class required that I write a paper. So I sat down with my typewriter and proceeded to work through my thoughts about free will. It was, as far as I can recall, the first college paper I wrote because I wanted to understand the subject and not because I wanted a grade. It made a great deal of difference. I started that paper by simply looking at the fact that I was sitting there writing a paper. And I asked the question, how much free will is going into the construction of this paper? Let me update that situation a bit. I'm sitting here recording this presentation. How much free will is going into the construction of this presentation? Well, honestly, none. So what is happening as I construct this presentation? Well, I force air out of my lungs that cause my vocal cords to vibrate. This produces a set of compression waves in the air. Signals from my brain also travel down my nerves to the muscle tissue in my mouth, which alters the shape of my mouth, the position of my tongue and lips, all of this in order to create variations in those compression waves. Those compression waves strike the microphone, and that turns those compression waves into ones and zeros that are stored in an electric file on my laptop. It's all physics. To say that there's something called free will is to say that there's something other than physics responsible for creating these compression waves. And that just seems highly unlikely. But one may ask, why am I sitting here making these compression waves? Well, the compression waves themselves might be physics, but my decision to create them, could that be based on something else? My actions, my decisions, to not only make this video, but every word and format decision, my inflections and tone, are expressions of my values. The 2 hours I will spend recording this video are 2 hours I could be spent playing computer games, watching television, or studying the history of the 30 Years' War, which is on my reading list. Because of my values, I'm recording this presentation. And where did those values come from? Well, I think it's safe to say that each desire expressed by my creating this presentation must either come from something or come from nothing. I mean, those are the only two options, right? Well, I suppose that my values could be timeless and uncaused, but I see no reason to accept that option. My memories certainly don't go back that far. Reason suggests that my first desires or values came into existence a few months after my body came into existence. For some of my desires, there's no mystery as to where they came from. In the same way that evolution gave me a heart, a couple of kidneys, some bones and skin, each having several properties of their own, it gave me a brain that has certain properties. Among those properties are desires to eat, to drink, to have sex, to seek a comfortable environment that's not too warm or too cold. It gave me an aversion to pain. It also gave me a disposition to react to some things with disgust and to other things with approval, a disposition to react to the actions of other animals with anger or with gratitude. And evolution also made my brain malleable. Experiences alter the structure of my brain. This allows me to learn a language and to acquire beliefs about the world around me. To believe that there's a tree where there's a tree, or to believe that there is food. To believe that there's a predator where there might be a predator. Maybe it's not a predator, but let's not take the risk. This malleable brain also makes it the case that experiences can alter my values, my desires. My parents, my teachers, friends, encounters with strangers, things that happened when I was alone, all had direct and indirect influences on shaping my values. I can't easily trace direct lines from causes to effects. The signals are much too noisy. But I have no doubt that they're there. So the desires that motivate me to create this video come from a long history of interactions between my genes in my environment, from my nature, and from my experiences. Could some of those values have come from nothing? Could they have just appeared? I rather doubt it, but let's admit to the possibility. Let's assume that as I sleep tonight, some uncaused cause pushes the neurons in my brain around so that I wake up and discover that I have, for example, a sudden desire to watch sport. If this were to happen, it wouldn't be something that we could confuse with free will. The idea of free will says that something comes about not from nothing, but from me, that I did it. So, how could something be a result of free will? It'd have to be brought about on purpose, an effect of something that is me, but which is uncaused and yet did not come from nothing. And that's a pretty tall order to fill. I'd say it never happened. There is no third option. But then we have the claim that if my action didn't come from this third option, I can't be morally responsible for my action. Is that true? Well, I do make choices, and those choices are expressions of my values. That's not an illusion. Evolution has given me a deliberative process that very roughly seems to work as follows. I consider various options. In doing this, I look at what each option, each possible action will bring about or prevent. My desires assign values to certain things being brought about or prevented, and then I select the option with the highest value. In this way, my actions are expressions of my values. If I wanted something different, if I had different values, I would select a different option. Now, of course, this is a gross oversimplification, but it's good enough for my purposes here. Making choices doesn't require free will. We can create computer programs to play games by considering a set of moves, seeing what each move would bring about or prevent, assign values to those states being brought about or prevented, and selecting moves that realize the highest value. No free will is required. Furthermore, what the future will be like depends in part on my choices. That part is true too. The values that I have, combined with my beliefs, make it the case that I spend time creating this video. The fact that I'm creating this video instead of doing something else means that the future will be a little bit different. It'll contain one more video, and whatever comes from that video being created. The fact that I have the values that I have, and that I choose the action that best realizes those values, has an effect. And it's because of me, because of my values, that one more video exists instead of a mountain being climbed or a ball game being watched. Because what's true in the future depends at least partially on my values, other people have reasons to be concerned with what those values are. They have reasons to nurture in me and in others those desires that will motivate us to act in ways that consider their welfare and interests, and to prevent the growing of desires in me and others that would motivate us to cause them pain and suffering. Now, because my values are determined in part by my interactions with my environment, their concern with what values I have means that they have reasons to promote an environment, a culture, that nurtures within each of us those desires that are useful, and a culture that starves in each of us those desires that are harmful. We have reasons to promote in each of us desires to keep promises, for example, to tell the truth, to protect each other and those we care about from harm. Well, we have reasons to discourage within each of us those desires that would motivate actions that are a cause of harm. So, if I should break a promise, the values that motivated me to break that promise may have been caused, but this doesn't change the fact that people have reasons to create a culture in which a desire to keep promises will flourish, and to do so by condemning those who break promises and praising those who keep promises in difficult circumstances. If people were to shout and curse and condemn me for being so selfish and untrustworthy, I'd have to say, yeah, that makes sense. I can fully understand the need and the value of condemning those who break promises under those circumstances. Ultimately, I see the free will thesis, the notion that free will is required for moral responsibility, to be a mistake. And if we look at history, the mistake actually comes from an attempt to answer what is essentially a religious question. It's telling that many of those who claim that moral responsibility requires free will describe their thesis in religious terms. Alan Strawson, who I talked about in the fourth video in this set, wrote that the type of moral responsibility he denies is, quote, moral responsibility of such a kind that, if we have it, it makes sense at least to suppose that it could be just to punish some of us with eternal torment in hell and reward others with eternal bliss in heaven, end quote. Indeed, free will and a type of moral responsibility that depends on free will might be required to make divine punishments appear justified. We may need free will to make it the case that the behavior that brings about divine punishment or divine rewards isn't God's fault. On this account, humans freely choose to follow God or not. In making that free choice, humans choose their own fate in the afterlife. God gave us the gift of free will, and some people abuse that gift, making the wrong choice, which results in divine punishment. We are supposed to choose to follow God. To deal with the problem of justified divine punishment, philosophers in the early Middle Ages latched onto the twin concepts of free will and deserved retribution for wrongdoing. But morality as practiced isn't concerned with the justification of punishment in the afterlife. We're concerned with the actions and inactions of others whose behavior has consequences in this life. Still, we have a question. To what degree have the concepts of free will and divine retribution influenced morality as practiced? Clearly, there's been some influence. Free will and retribution are major parts of the conversation. But for several reasons, I think that the substantive impact has been pretty limited. First, the fact that one creature's values can have an influence on another creature's evolutionary fitness has not escaped the forces of natural selection. As soon as some creatures acquired systems that allowed their desires and aversions, their values, to be modified by experience, other creatures acquired dispositions to create experiences that would promote useful desires and aversions. Anger and gratitude, dispositions to punish and to reward, have a biological foundation that precedes beliefs about God by perhaps hundreds of millions of years, allowing for the emergence of extremely complex systems that make animal communities and cooperation possible. Do not steal from other members of the herd or colony. Do not murder other members of the herd or colony. Aid them when they're in trouble. These practices were in place long before the first thought of a god emerged, and it was left to the inventors of the first gods to write these principles into their theology. The religious text tends to fix moral judgments on what was believed to be useful in the distant past. Religions remain practical. Scripture must be interpreted. So as new pragmatic discoveries are made concerning the sentiments that turn out to be useful or harmful, religious texts get reinterpreted, allowing the practitioners to declare this must have been what God meant all along. Scripture supports the divine right of kings until it supports all men are created equal and are endowed with certain inalienable rights. God endorses slavery until God condemns slavery. Literal interpretations and universal commands eventually become metaphors. And whatever cannot be reinterpreted can simply be ignored. And religious ethics simply have nothing to say about a great many moral issues. What exactly counts as theft, and what are the limits of property rights? What obligations are created by the making of a promise, and when can a promise be legitimately broken? What counts as an assault? What even counts as murder? We have to find answers to these questions ourselves, and our arguments seem to focus on whether it's a good idea to draw a line here or there. The concept of free will might have seemed important to justify divine retribution, but this concept doesn't bring with it any implications about what is to be punished or rewarded. That has to come from someplace else. The concept of free will really has nothing to say about the day-to-day workings of conventional morality. And there's this other question that's been on my mind a lot. People say that free will is needed to justify moral condemnation. Please tell me, how does free will justify condemnation? Okay, it makes sense to me that if you're claiming that condemnation is justified, then you're saying that there are reasons to condemn. But if action is free, in the strict free will sense, you can't be saying that condemnation influences action. If condemnation influences action, then action isn't free in the strict free will sense. It's caused, and condemnation is one of its causes. If condemnation doesn't influence action, then why condemn? In other words, what does justify condemnation? Well, it seems to be that it's the practice of condemnation has certain effects. It's one of the components of a culture, alongside praise, that causes people to acquire certain values. There are reasons to condemn when condemnation promotes values that are useful to others. The usefulness of those values provides the reason for others to use condemnation to promote them. We condemn lying, breaking promises, deceptive manipulation, fraud, theft, vandalism, rape, assault, murder, because we have reasons to make these types of behavior less common. The disposition to engage in these behaviors depends on a person's values. One way to promote useful values that'll make this type of behavior less common is to condemn those who engage in this type of behavior. But this requires that the values that motivate an agent's behavior are caused, and that one of the causes of those values is the culture of praise and condemnation itself. I'm willing to cut the concept of free will out of all discussion of morality entirely. It doesn't actually play much of a role. It isn't actually relevant to most debates about which values to encourage and which to discourage. Should moral responsibility be discarded as well? Don't see any reason to do that. Our actions are expressions of our values. Some actions express values that people have reasons to nurture through their use of praise and reward, to promote in their stories, their institutions, and their laws. Some actions express values that people have reasons to inhibit, to starve so that they may sprout only rarely, if at all. And the values that others have reasons to nurture or inhibit in me, I generally have reasons to nurture or inhibit in others. And this gives me an incentive to participate in the practice of praise and condemnation that nurture or inhibit those values. So where did I end up? I ended up thinking that the idea of free will is a mistake. It's a mistake largely motivated by a need to justify divine retribution. And that's not a real problem that needs solving. The morality that applies to us in our daily interactions with each other is a different topic entirely. In this world, I make choices, such as my choice to create this video. My choices are the expression of my values. I make this video out of a hope that it will realize things that I value. If I had different values, I'd be doing something else. Those values in turn have their own causes. They have come about as a result of interactions between my genes and my environment. The causes that influence my values include those of my family, my friends, strangers, things I saw and heard, things that I read, and other experiences that I've had. They include my being raised in an environment that included moral praise and moral condemnation. There are values, desires, that people generally, including me, have reasons to nurture in everybody else. Those that help and protect other people, and those that prevent people from causing harm. There are values that people generally have reasons to inhibit. We have reasons to deny them fertile ground on which to grow because where they do grow, they bring about real harms. This means that there's a question to be answered, whether the action that I perform spring from the desires that people really do have reasons to nurture, or those that people really do have reasons to inhibit. In other words, not only does moral responsibility make sense, there's a fact of the matter respecting the values we should be promoting or inhibiting through our use of moral praise and condemnation. Although that's a discussion for another time.